Well, good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Y'all with me this morning? Y'all ready to get going? Perfect. We are starting a brand new series that I am pretty pumped about. It is called For the People in the Back. So all the people in the back, let me know you're here. There you go. We are, it's actually going to be a pretty fun one for me. This is going to sound weird. I love the Bible in itself. I love the whole Bible. But what I'm about to say, I do love some books of the Bible more than others. And one of them for me is actually the book that we're going to get to walk through the whole month of July. And so the book that we're going to be going through in this series called For the People in the Back is the book of James. The book of James is, like I said, it's one of my favorite books of the Bible. Simply from the fact that James doesn't sugarcoat anything. He doesn't sugarcoat a thing. And some of y'all are probably like, oh, I came to the wrong week. No, it's wonderful. He does a great job. He's actually the little brother of Jesus. They were like, I didn't know Jesus had a brother. Yes, he was as much human as he was God when he came to earth. And so he had a brother. Mary and Joseph had a family that he was a part of, and his little brother was named James. And James got to walk. I don't know if you all had ever thought about that before, but how awesome would that be? And as the youngest, always living in the footsteps of my older brother, I don't know if that would be a pretty hard act to follow, right? Jesus is what I'm talking about. It'd be pretty hard to follow. If you're the baby of the family and you're having to follow what Jesus did, think of the expectations that you're going to have to live up to. And so for him, it was this moment of being able to follow Jesus as a brother and be able to know Jesus 100%. So he knew Jesus in front of the crowd, and he knew Jesus behind the crowd, away from the crowd. And so it's this wonderful opportunity that we get to open up this book of James, and we get to see really what is it supposed to look like? What is this Christian thing supposed to look like? What's this Christian life supposed to look like? So what I've titled today's sermon is A Life of Consistency. I think if we're going to start right at the spot, at the beginning of what I like to call the Christian life manual. You know, everything you buy has an owner's manual. How many of you all read the owner's manual? Oh, yeah. Wow, okay, a couple people actually read the owner's manual. I only go to the owner's manual when I need help. And I think that's far too often what we do in the Bible. Is that sometimes we only go to the Bible when we need help, or when we're in need, or we're going, Jesus, I need you. Oh, I go to. I'm just going to let the wind tell me where to go. It's not how it's technically supposed to go. James kind of outlines that for us in his book, and he gives us what I like to call as the Christian life owner's manual. And it's this wonderful book where he does a great job. He doesn't sugarcoat things. He lays it all out there, pretty clear, pretty vivid, and straight to the point. And so this morning we're going to start in chapter 1. See, the cool thing about James is there's 5 chapters of James, and there's 5 months of July. And they both start with J. Kind of crazy. So it's pretty cool that we're going to get to do this, like I said, one of my favorite books. But today we're going to talk about this idea of a life of consistency. Real quick, before we dive in, I wanted to show you a picture. So every morning, on Sunday morning, we meet as a volunteer group. We huddle, is what we call it. And so we pray over the service, we pray over the day, we pray over you all that are going to show up. And so this morning, we snapped a picture of what I believe, here on earth, is a very good representation of a life of consistency. So in the middle there, you have Brother Dale and Miss Barb. And Brother Dale's going, I didn't even know that they took this picture. And so that's the greatest part about it. And so what is pretty neat is that tomorrow they actually get to celebrate 60 years of marriage. And so as we're talking about the life life of consistency. I believe that there's a part that, yes, we talk about our faith, and we talk about what happens when we're consistent in our walk, and we talk about what happens when we're consistent with God, but there also comes a part where we talk about our life in general. Like, if you're not living a consistent life in your life, and it's all crazy and disarray and mumble-jumbled and you name it, what are you showing? What is the life that you're showing people that you're living? So I want to say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a representation of what that looks like.
Amen. Thank you.
60 years. Whew, that's a long time. That is a long time. So we are going to start in James chapter 1, but before we do, I want to give you a little heads up. We're going to talk about three things today that I really believe, if we're talking about a life of consistency, that in our life, we have to start being consistent with. Is that all right with you?
That's right.
First thing we're going to talk about, we're just going to get this one out of the way. We've got to be consistent with God. How many of y'all would agree with that?
Yeah.
If we're going to live a life of consistency, we have to be consistent with God.
Right.
Now that's not that you're going to hear something a little later that I think you're going to. Well, didn't you just talk about that? And so we're going to specifically talk about your relationship with God, and what that looks like, and how you can be consistent. And matter of fact, we get to start off with one of my very favorite passages in the Bible. And I'm going to give you a couple ways that it's said, but the way that I have it today for you today, let's read. It's James chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. And it says, "Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature, complete, and lacking nothing. Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without doubting. For the doubter is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind." So I want to take a step back, and I want to go to the very beginning of this passage. Now, what I was saying is there's a few different ways that it's talked about. So specifically today in this passage, I was reading from the CSB because I like how it describes the wind tossing you around like the surging sea. And so, but there's different ways that different versions talks about what going through trials produces. This one, it talks about the endurance that it produces. How many of you all have ever watched someone in a race, or have ever gone to a track meet or a marathon? Anybody in this room? Anybody ever competed in one? Okay, a few of you. Great. Y'all are better than me. I guess I have. Competed in a Spartan. And I would advise no one to ever do that. It was horrible. Because I did not train and have the endurance. But so, what it's talking about here in this version is the endurance that it takes. And so when we're talking about endurance, I often think of running. And I often think of what it takes to get through a race. You know, sprinters generally have a shorter endurance because their ability and their skill that they have is a quick burst. It's a quick burst of energy and get to the finish line and rest. But if somebody's doing cross country or marathons, it's one of those where they have to make sure that their endurance is something over a longer period of time, miles even. And so their endurance is something far different. Their training is different. Sprinters train by sprinting. Generally, what you do is you train by sprinting longer distances than what you're actually having to sprint. The same thing goes with people that are running. As they're building up to running, whatever it might be, a half marathon, a marathon, you're not just going to go from the couch to running a marathon. Sorry. I don't think you're going to do that. If you do, you're going to be a lot of pain. Your body's probably going to want to shut down at some point in time during the middle of it. Was that Curtis patting your leg saying, don't try? Okay. So what we see is that the training looks different depending on what the endurance that is needed. And so for us, we get to see that these trials that we go through, and the Bible tells us it's going to be trials of all different types. It's going to be trials that are hard, it's going to be trials that are easy. I mean, think about it. Just this morning, you faced a trial. You did. If you have kids, I know you did. Believe me, you face a trial every single morning. If it's like mine, getting their clothes on. Yes, Camden, you actually have to wear underwear. Why do I have to wear these shoes? Because I told you to. We won't go on. You know what I'm talking about. And so then you get on the road, and I know that you face some trials on the road, especially if somebody was in front of you driving, whatever, the speed limit. Yeah, trials. Various kinds. And another translation talks through it, and it says it's perseverance. Which sometimes I think we go, well, perseverance and endurance is the same thing. I think it is, depending on how you look at it. Perseverance is what it takes to push through something and keep going even when it gets tough. Endurance is something that is, it really is a lot of the same things. They can go hand in hand. I just think for us, we think of it differently. And so one of those things in perseverance, when we talk through the instance of perseverance, I think perseverance is built just like endurance. And then lastly, the ESV talks about it as this steadfastness. And I think that brings it to the context, a really good context for us in our walk with God and being consistent with God is this steadfastness. Knowing that no matter what, no matter how the wind tosses you over here, no matter how how many of you all have ever seen waves in the ocean before? Perfect. There is not a wave that is ever the same. Not one. Waves aren't consistent. They aren't. They can be big, they can be small, they can break far out, they can break close to the shore, they can be really abrupt, they can be just little rolling waves. And so we see that just like that, when we use this representation of what the ocean is like, and it's the winds pushing us, and it's this moment where we're here, and then we're there, and then we're there, where we're all over the place when we're not consistent. And we don't have that steadfastness that we need to have when we're consistent with God. James 1:2, it goes on and it drops down and it says, "Blessed is the one who endures trials, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him." That's what we're after, right? We hope to someday be glorified in heaven. That's the day that we're looking forward to, the day that we get to enter in the gates and walk on the streets of gold and see the mansions that have been prepared ahead of us and get to praise God right then and there. That's the day we're after. But it takes a life of consistency. It takes endurance. It takes perseverance. It takes steadfastness. If you go back to the end of that last passage, what I love about it is it talks about being mature and complete and not lacking anything. When you build those things in your life and you're consistent with God, it's a promise that you don't lack. That you don't have to want any longer because you have everything that you need. You're complete. You are mature. Mature means that you are grown. You have knowledge in your faith and in your life. And so we get to see what it's like when you are consistent with God. We go down to verse 16 through 18. It says, "Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. By his own choice, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And so what we get to see is that God's plan for us was that we were going to be his first fruits. We were going to be the fruits that he put off. And when we get a little later in the service, I'm going to talk about some of those fruits that we get to produce when we're consistent. This passage in verse 16, it says, don't be deceived. You all know that the world is trying to deceive us every day, all around us. If you watch the news, you definitely know it. I'm not going to get on that soapbox right now. But you all know what I'm talking about. You know that it's out there. You know that deception is real. You know that the world doesn't want us to believe that we are enough, and that God is enough, and that we have everything that we need. Consumer culture that we live in. We want that, and we wanted it yesterday. We have to have that, and we needed it yesterday. And so it's this whole thing of being over here. And so we even get to see a different way that James describes it. Is he goes into, he first talks about the waves, the crashing waves being blown around by the wind. I heard a pastor actually at Youth Conf. He talked about it like a bucket of bouncy balls. And he actually tossed the bucket. I've never seen that done before, but he tossed the bucket of bouncy balls out into the audience. And they went everywhere. They scattered. And it was such an awesome opportunity to see what it looks like when you aren't consistent with God. You're here, you're there, you're everywhere. I mean, bouncy balls don't stop until they finally come to rest and get something. They find something that's consistent, and they hold to it. Right? If not, they're bouncing here, they're bouncing there, and they're rolling around on the floor, and then you step on it, and you fall. And you know how it goes, right? Tucker was playing with one the other day. I don't know if he had ever seen a bouncy ball. And he loved it. It was I love seeing that in our kids. Just different things that they see, and different things that they pick up, and different things that they learn. It's so much fun to get to see. Tucker, he's 1.5, and so he picked up the bouncy ball and said, whoa, 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 you can't have that. Because every parent thinks they're going to swallow it. Well, then I proceeded to see that he was throwing it against the wall and loved how it would bounce back, and it would bounce off of different things. And I was sitting in my bathroom watching him do this, and I'm going, he is so amazed by how something so simple and so simplistic works. But it gave me that opportunity to go, that's what we're like. When we are consistent, and we're just constantly getting blown around by the wind, and we're constantly getting shifted over here, and we're constantly going over there, trying something new, or we're going to try something new over here, or we're over here, and we're over there, and we're everywhere. Because we can't find the lane that God wants us to be consistent in. Then it talks about the other way that it describes it is the shifting shadows. As I was preparing for this, I kind of thought about that. And even while I was worshiping, I looked up here and you can see shadows. In multiple directions, there's shadows all around. We affect our shadow, right? Our shadow moves with us. It walks with us. I move my hands, my shadow moves. What is this actually? What is this saying? Why would they use this to describe what is it like? And when we're in God's love, it's not like being in the shifting shadows. And so I began to process through this. And the thing that I kind of came down to is that when shadows are scattered out, when a shadow is formed, they eventually move. Right? When the sun changes, a shadow doesn't stay in the same place. For instance, if you've ever been to the beach and you put up an umbrella, for a moment you're good. As the day goes on, your umbrella doesn't do you any good because it's constantly changing. as shadows aren't consistent. They can be dark, they can be light, they can be here, they can be there. They're not consistent. The love of God is always consistent.
Yeah, that's right.
The love of God is always consistent in our life. And so for us, when we're not in this shadow, we're not in the shifting shadows of God's grace and God's love, it's consistent. It doesn't move. It doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forevermore.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter where the sun is. It doesn't matter. Believe me, the sun's always going to rise in the east and it's going to set in the west. But it's not going to, shadows change. He doesn't change. So we go on. We say, what else do we have to be consistent with? It's no wonder that James wrote the book like this. He was a follower of Jesus, so we would have heard Jesus talk about what are the two greatest commandments. Greatest commandment of all is love, first of all, God. With all your heart, soul, and mind, and strength. Everything about you, you love God. And then he said the second is like it. And he said you have to love your neighbor as yourself. So James, I believe as you walk through the first chapter, and first of all, the first chapter is kind of this overview of the book. So we're going to revisit some of these topics as we go on in the different chapters in the book. The second thing that we come to that we have to be consistent with is others. If we know that Jesus has called us to love God first and then other people, we have to be consistent with them. We can't be over here and over there and everywhere else with people. We have to be consistent with them. James talks about it like this. This is going to be a common passage for most people that have been in church any time in their life at all. Or if you've ever been told this in a derogatory manner. I've been told it a time or two in my life. It says, know this, verse 19, know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. See, I hate that sometimes people use the Bible as a means of getting on to people. But I think sometimes it's where a lot of the truth can be found in those moments.
Amen.
And when you're disciplining, I believe that the truth is always best to use. And so what this is saying is that, hey, first of all, you've got to be consistent with listening to people. You have to be consistent with opening up your ears and hearing what someone says. Actually taking in what someone says so that you don't just spout off. You have to be slow to speak so that your mouth isn't constantly moving so that you can listen. I have that problem. I like to talk. And so sometimes I forget to listen because I like to talk. And mixed with the fact that I'm a fixer, I really screw up sometimes with Whitney. Because she'll come to me with a problem, and before she even finishes her problem and telling me about it, I'm on to how we're going to fix it. And how we're going to get past it. And how you just need to get over it. Instead of listening to the actual situation. And lastly, slow to anger. How many of you all have ever dealt with this a little bit? Anybody? I'm raising my hand. I'm human. There are times in my life where I've experienced anger. I've had anger. And it's not fun. It's one of those moments where it's kind of like a ticking time bomb, right? Where you feel something is building up, it's building up, it's building up, and then all of a sudden, wah! It all comes out. Because the gates can only hold something so much and so long before it all comes out. We've got to be consistent in how we handle and deal with others. And it goes on, verse 20, and it deals with anger. It says, for the anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness. Receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. I love that. I love the word meek. I think far too often when we think of someone who has that true gift of meekness, the world oftentimes views them as having weakness. But meekness does not at all mean that someone is weak. Actually, in my opinion, it means that you're humble. It means that you understand that you don't have to have it all, because God has it all. And He's promised it to you. And so that's where we get that word meekness. Third thing that we have to be consistent with. This is where I said, you're probably going to go, did he just talk about that? But I promise it's different. You have to be consistent with your walk. Your walk. How you actually live out your relationship with God. Because it's one thing to say, I have a relationship with God, and it's another thing to not at all look like you have a relationship with God. And so we have to be consistent with our walk. James 1:22. If there is one verse in the Bible that I think everybody should 100% memorize, is this. It's one of my favorites in the Bible. It says, be not doers of the word, and not hearers only. Be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. So James is saying, hey, it's not good enough just to hear the word if you don't put it to action. If you're not going to take this step and say, I've got to do something about this. I've got to do something different. How many of you all have ever heard the saying that if you want to see different outcomes, you've got to do things differently? That's the moment in your faith where you can have the faith and you can have a relationship with God, but until you do something about it, no one sees it. So whether that's a first step by getting baptized, whether that's you being plugged into a church, being consistent with your faith in church, being consistent in your faith with either serving or pouring in, those are ways that you can say, hey, I'm acting it out. I'm not just sitting, not calling out the people in the back, but that's the title of the sermon series. I'm not just sitting in the back hanging out. I'm engaged. I want to be a part of this. I want to do something about it. I want to do something differently. Craig Rochelle says something that I absolutely love. He says, if you want to reach people that no one's reaching, you have to do things that no one's doing. And I love that. So there's one verse that I want you to have it here. But be doers of the word, not only hearers, deceiving yourselves. Because it's easy for us to go, well, I came to church. I'm good. I go to a life group.
Once he goes
I even pray every morning.
once he starts praying at the end,
Amen.
so it kind of bears out.
We can deceive ourselves to think that that's enough. We can deceive ourselves to think, well, I'm good. I'm good. You've got to do something different. You've got to act it out. You've got to make sure that, and I'm not saying be boastful about it, but people will determine. I know you say you go to church, but you don't act like it on Saturday night, or Friday night, or Thursday night, or you may. Maybe any night of the week you don't act like it. Goes on in verse 23 through 25, it says, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away, and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, there's that word, persevere, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. How many of you all in the room want to be blessed by God? Big time. I think we'd be crazy to say that we don't want to be blessed. That would be insane. I want to be blessed by God. I want you to be blessed by God. And I believe that He's ready to pour out blessings upon your life. He's asking you to do something different. I told you we were going to get back to that first fruits mentality, or the fruit that you get to produce. Another passage of mine that I really love is John 15:5. It specifically says, David, you don't have this one. I added this morning. It says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you could do nothing. So we see that another version says that if we remain. So if we abide or remain in God and he is in us, then we will produce much fruit. I don't know about you, but I come from an agricultural background. I think probably most people around here have seen it. You cull out the ones that don't produce the good fruit. So that's what Jesus says. He says, if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. But if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. Now, hold it for a second. It's not anything you want. And it's not just whenever you want. When your heart is God's heart. When your heart wants God's heart for your life, then he will give you what you ask for. That's the difference. It comes right back to that consistency. The consistency with God produces a consistent walk. And so when you have consistency with God, the consistent walk becomes natural. And that's what we get to see, is that it becomes this full circle, consistent life. As it goes on in verse 8, this is where we get the promise from God. It says, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. That's the promise. When we abide in him and he abides in us and we produce the fruit, that's how he knows that we are his followers. That's how he knows that we have a relationship with him. That's how he knows that we aren't just a hearer, but a doer. And lastly, the first chapter of James ends, and it says, this is the slap to the face, so be ready. It says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Ouch. We're going to talk about bridling of the tongue a little later in James. But think about that. Someone that's religious. We know that the religious people of the time are some of the main ones who crucified Jesus. They had heard the stuff. They had read the things that said there would be a Messiah sent to save the world. They didn't believe it. They heard it. They knew it. They had learned about it their whole life. It's what they went to school for. It's what they were trained for. They knew all of it. They didn't walk it out. They didn't believe it. They weren't consistent. They were consistent. They were consistent against it. But we see that even the ones that were religious were the same ones who crucified Jesus, who was the most consistent person of all. And we see time and time again when we're kind of pressed back against the wall and we're wondering, what do we do? What do we say? We'll speak the truth. If there's something that I hope that you get out of James, it's that the Bible is the truth and it's nothing but the truth. Its words are real, its words are true, it's still living today. The power of God is still real in all of our lives if we have said yes to him. If we've created that first consistent walk, the consistent with God, then we get to see our consistency with others. And then lastly, we get to see it come full circle with our consistency in our walk. So this morning, I want to pray. I want to pray for those of you all that say, you know what, I've been a Christian for a long time, but I don't know if I've ever been consistent. And maybe I've been consistent in part of my life, but I've not been consistent with all of my life. And I would like to know how many of you all would say, and you can raise your hands, you can look up at me, whatever you want to do. How many of you all would say, you know what, I've fallen into the category of a hearer and not a doer? Anybody in the room that would say, and if you want to, you can put your hands up and put it right back down. And I want to pray for those this morning that say, I've fallen into that category of just hearing God's word, but not living it out. Amen. 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 And it's one of those things that we talked about it last week, even. When we talk about walking through the gate, when we talk about Jesus being the gate, and when we walk through that gate, we get to live in the freedoms of God. It's the same thing that we're talking about here. When we step out of the moment of just being a hearer and we walk into the opportunity of being a doer, it unlocks this freedom that we get to have because of the consistency that we begin to develop in our life. So I want to pray for you all this morning that not only do you have strength, but you have the courage. Because remember, James said at the very beginning that there were going to be trials. But when your faith is tested, that's when you get to see the endurance or the perseverance or the steadfastness that you have created because of the training that you've gone through. Let's pray.